You've never seen reality. Here's what you actually see. Right now, you're looking at this room. You think you're seeing it. You're not. What you're experiencing right now, the colors, the distances, the edges of objects, is not the world. It's your brain's prediction of the world. The actual data arriving at your eyes is shockingly sparse. Wavelengths of light, patterns of contrast, fragments. Your brain takes those fragments, matches them against millions of stored predictions built over your entire lifetime, and generates, in real time, the seamless experience you call seeing. You are not watching a live broadcast of reality. You are watching your brain's best guess, updated every fraction of a second, so smoothly you never notice the seams. 2,500 years ago, the Buddha looked at perception and called it a mirage, vivid, compelling, and not what it appears to be. This video is about why that word was more precise than he could have known, and what it means for how you suffer. Chapter 1: The Discovery. In 2017, the neuroscientist Anil Seth walked onto a TED stage and said something that made millions of people uncomfortable. He described a phrase he'd helped popularize, one that sounds like philosophy, but is, he insists, a description of biological fact. We're all hallucinating all the time. When we agree about our hallucinations, we call it reality. Now, Seth didn't invent this idea from nowhere. He was drawing on decades of work in computational neuroscience, work that had been quietly rewriting our understanding of what brains actually do. But he gave it a name that stuck. He called ordinary perception a controlled hallucination, not a metaphor, not a provocation, a description of what happens between your eyes and your experience every waking moment. Here's what he means. For most of the history of brain science, people assumed perception worked like a camera. Light hits your retina. Signals travel up to your brain. Your brain assembles an image. You see, input, processing, output. Straightforward. It's wrong. What actually happens is closer to the opposite. Your brain doesn't wait for data to arrive and then build a picture. Your brain is already generating the picture before the data arrives. It predicts what you're about to see based on everything it's learned before. Every face, every room, every morning, every threat. Then, when sensory data actually arrives from your eyes, your brain doesn't use that data to build experience. It uses that data to check its prediction, to error correct, to ask, was I close enough? If the prediction is good enough, and it usually is, you never notice the process at all. You just see, seamlessly, effortlessly, as though the world was simply presenting itself to you. But you are not seeing the world. You are seeing your brain's hypothesis about the world. A hypothesis so good, so fast, so constantly updated that it feels like the thing itself. The man who formalized this mathematically is a physicist and neuroscientist named Karl Friston. If Seth gave predictive processing its public face, Friston gave it its skeleton. His framework, often called the free energy principle, proposes that the brain's fundamental job is not to perceive, not to think, not to feel, but to minimize surprise, to reduce the gap between what it predicts and what actually arrives at its senses. In Friston's model, your brain is running a constant multi-layered cascade of predictions, high-level predictions at the top of the cortical hierarchy. I'm in my kitchen. It's morning. The coffee cup is where I left it. Generate expectations that flow downward. These top-down predictions meet bottom-up sensory signals coming from your eyes, your ears, your skin. Where prediction matches signal, nothing happens. The prediction stands. Where signal deviates from prediction, a cup isn't where you expected it. a sound you didn't anticipate. A prediction error fires upward, and the model updates. Here's the detail that should stop you. In your primary visual cortex, the very first place in your brain where visual information is processed, feedback connections flowing downward from higher brain areas anatomically outnumber feed-forward connections coming up from the eyes, often by an order of magnitude. Your brain is sending more information down, more prediction, than your eyes are sending up. The philosopher Andy Clark, who has spent decades bridging neuroscience and philosophy of mind, put it plainly. He called human beings prediction machines, devices that have evolved to anticipate incoming streams of sensory stimulation before they arrive. Sensation, in Clark's phrase, is the leash on imagination. Your brain is imagining the world. Your senses just tug the leash when the imagination drifts too far. You don't see with your eyes. You see with your predictions. Your eyes just check the homework. If this still feels abstract, let's make it concrete. Let's watch the prediction machine get caught in the act. There is an illusion called the hollow mask illusion. You take a mask, a face, and you turn it around so you're looking at the concave hollow inside. You know it's hollow. You can see the edges. Everything about the sensory data arriving at your eyes says, this is a concave surface curving away from you, and you see a face protruding toward you. Three-dimensional, fully convex. Your brain's prediction. Faces protrude. Faces are convex. I have never in my life encountered a concave face. Overrides the sensory data entirely, not subtly, completely. You cannot unsee the protruding face, even when you know you're wrong. Even when someone explains the illusion. Even when you watch the mask rotate and catch the switch happening. Your prediction is stronger than your evidence. Roughly 99% of neurotypical people cannot override this. The 1% who can see the hollow mask as hollow. Many of them are people living with conditions where top-down predictive systems carry less weight, where the brain's prior expectations have loosened their grip. They see the truth of the mask, but this comes at enormous cost elsewhere, because the same predictive machinery that tricks you about the mask is also what gives you a coherent world, faces you recognize, rooms that hold still, a morning that makes sense before you've finished opening your eyes. Seeing through the illusion, it turns out, is not the same thing as being free of it. Remember that. We'll come back to it. Now consider color. You look at a white piece of paper in bright sunlight. Then you look at the same piece of paper in shadow. The wavelengths of light hitting your retina in those two situations are entirely different. Sometimes as different as the wavelengths reflecting off a blue surface versus a yellow one. But you see white paper both times, same white, unwavering. Your brain subtracted the illuminant. It predicted white paper and held that prediction steady despite radically different input. Anil Seth puts it precisely. Wavelengths exist out there. Color exists only in here. What you call red, what you call blue, what you call the warmth of afternoon light on a wall. These are not properties of the world. They are your brain's predictions, painted onto a world that has no color of its own. Let's bring this home. Let's bring it to a morning. Your morning, or something close enough to feel familiar. Your alarm goes off. Before you're fully awake, before anything like conscious thought has formed, your brain has already activated a model. Morning, not just the sound of the alarm, but a prediction of what this morning contains. The time, the day of the week, the demands ahead, the state of your body, even a rough draft of how you feel about all of it. You haven't decided anything yet. The prediction arrived before you did. You reach for your phone. Your hand moves toward the bedside table before your eyes have fully opened. This isn't habit in the colloquial sense. It's active inference. Your motor system is executing a prediction. The phone is here, at this angle, at this distance. Your hand samples the world to confirm what your brain already expects. If the phone isn't there, if someone moved it, you feel a jolt of disorientation disproportionate to the actual problem. Because the error isn't just about a phone. It's a crack in the model. You open the lock screen. And here, right here, something important happens. You're expecting a message. Maybe from a specific person. Maybe just something. Your brain has generated a high-precision prediction about what the lock screen should show you. This prediction was running before you picked up the phone, before you knew you were looking. No message. And the feeling arrives. Not after deliberation, not after thought, but immediately as a felt quality of the moment. Disappointment, a faint sinking. Your brain generated a prediction of reward, and the reward didn't come. The prediction error registers not as a neutral data update, no message adjust model, but as an unpleasant feeling, a micro loss. Then the story begins. They haven't replied. They don't care. They're pulling away. I always end up here. Your brain's self-model, its ongoing prediction of who you are, where you stand in the world, what your relationships mean, has taken a tiny prediction error and elaborated it into a narrative. Not because the narrative is true, because narrating is what the predictive self-model does. It fills gaps. It explains prediction errors by constructing stories that keep the model coherent. And now your morning is colored, not by what actually happened, which was, an alarm sounded, you reached for a phone, a screen was empty, but by the predictions your brain generated, the errors it detected, and the story it told itself to make sense of those errors. By the time you have a feeling about your morning, the morning has already been constructed. You weren't there for the construction. You arrived for the verdict. This is what neuroscience has spent 30 years mapping. A brain that doesn't show you the world, but shows you its best guess about the world. A brain that constructs your morning before you open your eyes, paints color onto a colorless world, and turns a hollow mask into a face you cannot unsee. Remarkable, precise, well evidenced. But here's what's strange. Someone described this, not with brain scans, not with computational models, not with any instrument except sustained trained attention directed inward, 25 centuries ago, and the word he used was mirage. Chapter 2. The Mirage. There is a discourse in the Pali Canon, the Phenapindupama Sutta, the Lump of Foam Discourse, SN 22.95, where the Buddha asks his monks to look at 5 things that make up the entirety of human experience, and to see each one for what it actually is. Form, he says, is like a lump of foam on the Ganges, appearing solid from a distance, but when you pick it up and press it, there is nothing inside to hold. Feeling is like a water bubble, arising on the surface of a rain-struck pool, vanishing before you can examine it. Fabrications, the mental constructions that shape your thoughts and intentions, are like a banana trunk. You peel one layer, expecting to find the heartwood, and you peel another, and another, and there is no heartwood. There was never heartwood. Consciousness is like a magic show, vivid, captivating, absolutely convincing in the moment and upon examination, not what it appeared to be. And perception, saññā, the faculty that tells you what things are, that labels the world, that sorts the raw chaos of sensory contact into red and morning and face and danger. Perception, the Buddha says, is like a mirage. The simile is precise. A mirage is not nothing. Anyone who has driven a long road on a hot day has seen it. the shimmering on the asphalt ahead, the appearance of water where there is no water. It is vivid, it is compelling, and it drives action. You accelerate toward it, or you adjust your expectations, or you feel the brief anticipatory flicker of relief before you realize there is nothing there. The Buddha's instruction is specific. He says, suppose in the last month of the hot season, a mirage was shimmering, and a man with good eyesight were to see it, observe it, and appropriately examine it. To him, seeing it, observing it, appropriately examining it, it would appear empty, void, without substance. For what substance would there be in a mirage? In the same way, a monk sees, observes, and appropriately examines any perception, past, future, or present, and it appears empty, void, without substance. S.N. 22.95. Notice what the Buddha does not say. He does not say perception is fake. He does not say it doesn't happen. The mirage happens. You see it. It has effects. It shapes your behavior, your expectations, your felt experience of the moment. What the Buddha says is, when you examine it carefully, what it represents is not what it appears to be. The experience is real as an experience. What it points to, the water, the solid world of fixed things, was never there. This is not a rejection of perception. It is a precise diagnosis of what perception actually does. And what does it actually do? The Buddha is remarkably specific about this. More specific than he's often given credit for. In the Khandha Sutta S.N.N. 22.79, he defines saññā, perception, by its function. They perceive blue, they perceive yellow, they perceive red, they perceive white. Thus they are called perceptions. This sounds simple. It is not simple. What the Buddha is identifying is the act of categorical labeling, the moment when raw sensory contact is sorted into a recognized category. Not wavelengths of approximately 480 nanometers are arriving at the retina, but blue. The label comes, not from the contact itself, but from everything that has come before it. Every blue you have ever seen, every association you have ever built with blueness. The category is ready before the contact arrives. Thanissaro Bhikkhu, the American monk and translator whose renderings of the Pali Canon are among the most precise in English, puts it this way: memory plays a role in perception. We apply our old perceptions of pain to our new experience of pain. We use our memories from the past to cover up the present, to shape our experience of the present. Read that again. We use our memories from the past to cover up the present. We shape our experience of the present with templates built from what has already happened to us. This is a contemplative description of what Karl Friston formalized computationally. The brain doesn't wait for input and then label it. The brain's labels, its predictions, its prior categories, descend to meet the input. The label arrives before the data. The past covers the present. Now, and this matters, this is not to say that Buddhism had predictive coding. The methods are entirely different. The Buddha did not measure feedback connections in the visual cortex. Friston did not sit in sustained meditative absorption for 40 years. What is striking, genuinely striking, is that two entirely different methods of investigation, separated by 25 centuries and operating with completely different instruments, arrived at structurally similar descriptions of the same phenomenon. That perception is not reception, it is construction. And the materials of that construction come from the past. But the Buddha did something else that neuroscience has not done. He mapped what happens after the label lands. In the Madhupindika Sutta, the Honeyball Discourse, Mem. N18, one of the most psychologically precise teachings in the entire canon. The sequence is laid out with startling clarity. It begins with contact. Eye meets form, ear meets sound, mind meets mental object. From contact arises feeling, not emotion, but vedana, the bare feeling tone, pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. From feeling arises perception, saññā, the label, the recognition, the what is this. From perception arises thinking, and from thinking arises papanca, mental proliferation. The cascade of narrative, interpretation, self-reference, and elaboration that turns a moment of contact into a story about who you are and what the world is doing to you. The discourse describes it with an almost clinical precision. Perceptions and notions tinged by mental proliferation beset a man with regard to past, future, and present forms cognizable via the eye. N 18. Beset. The word choice is deliberate. By the time proliferation is running, it is no longer something you are doing. It is something happening to you. And notice where saññā sits in this chain. It is the middle stage, the pivot. It receives the feeling tone from below, and it hands a labeled, categorized, already interpreted package upward to thinking. By the time conscious thought begins, by the time you form a sentence in your head, vast pre-processing has already occurred. The labeling happened, the categorizing happened, the matching to past experience happened, all of it below the threshold of awareness. Thinking arrives late, picks up a pre-packaged delivery, and believes it is seeing the world for the first time. Let's go back to your morning. The same morning, but this time through the Buddha's lens. The alarm sounds. This is phassa, contact. Ear faculty meets sound. And in the same instant, saññā fires. Alarm, not the raw acoustic event. Pressure waves vibrating at a particular frequency. The label, the category. Alarm carries with it everything. It is morning. It is time. There are demands ahead. The label arrived preloaded. It was ready before the sound. You reach for the phone. This is sankhara, fabrication, the habitual constructions that shape action. Your hand moves not because of a conscious decision, but because of patterns laid down over thousands of mornings. The fabrication is older than today's awareness. It was built yesterday, last month, last year. You are reaching for the phone with your past. You expect a message. This is tanha, craving, in its subtlest, most latent form. Not the dramatic wanting of addiction or obsession, but the quiet gravitational pull of anticipation. The mind has already generated a prediction of reward. It has already leaned forward. No message. And now vedana, feeling tone, unpleasant. Not yet a story, not yet an interpretation, just the bare quality of the moment, a faint sinking, a micro contraction. The feeling tone was assigned before you had any say in it. Then, and this is where the chain reveals its power, the proliferation begins. They haven't replied. That is still close to observation. They don't care about me. That is papanca, mental proliferation. N 18. Perception has handed its labeled package to thinking, and thinking has elaborated it into a narrative about who you are and what your relationships mean. I always end up here. I am the one who gets left behind. The feeling became a perception. The perception became a thought. The thought became a self, a rejected self, an abandoned self, a self that has always been this way and always will be. By the time you put the phone down, the entire sequence, contact, feeling, perception, thinking, proliferation, self-construction, has run to completion. Your morning is no longer a morning. It is evidence for a story about who you are. And none of it was examined. None of it was seen in the act of construction. You arrived at the verdict without ever witnessing the trial. Two completely different traditions. One, looking at brains from the outside through machines, measuring feedback connections, modeling prediction errors, mapping computational cascades. One, looking at experience from the inside through trained attention, tracking the chain from contact to feeling to perception to proliferation with the precision of someone who has watched this sequence arise and pass away 10,000 times in a single sitting. They arrived at remarkably similar descriptions. Neither tradition needs the other to be true. Predictive processing does not require Buddhist validation. The Madhupindika Sutta does not need Karl Friston, but each illuminates the other in ways that are worth our time. Neuroscience can now describe the mechanism by which prediction precedes perception, the anatomy, the computation, the error correction cascade. Buddhism can describe what that mechanism feels like from the inside, and more importantly, what it costs. Because the mirage is not just interesting. The mirage is where suffering begins, but both traditions notice something else. Something more unsettling than the construction of a morning. Something more unsettling even than the realization that color exists only in here, and the world out there has no color of its own. Both traditions notice that the person who thinks they are having the morning, the one who reaches for the phone, who feels the disappointment, who tells themselves the story, that person is also constructed. The self that seems to stand behind perception, watching it unfold, is not watching from outside the process. It is part of the process. It is one more prediction, one more mirage. Chapter 3. The self is also a mirage. Anil Seth has a line that sounds, the first time you hear it, like it cannot possibly be true. He says, "We predict ourselves into existence, not metaphorically, not poetically," as a description of what the brain is doing right now to generate the experience you call being you. In his book, Being You, Seth lays out the argument carefully. The self, he writes, is another perception, another controlled hallucination. Though of a very special kind, it is not one thing, it is layered. At the most basic level, there is the bodily self, the felt sense that you have a body, that it is yours, that it occupies space, that it has boundaries. This is constructed from interoceptive signals, heartbeat, breathing, gut sensation, temperature, the constant low hum of being a biological organism. Your brain takes these signals and generates a prediction. This is my body. It is here. It is mine. That is so seamless, so constant, that you never think to question it. Above that, there is the perspectival self, the sense that you are located somewhere, that experience is happening from a particular point of view, that there is an in here distinct from an out there. This too is a prediction. It too is generated, not given. And above that, there is the narrative self, the story you tell about who you are, who you have been, who you are becoming. The self that has a name, a history, preferences, regrets, plans. The self that says I and means something continuous, something that persists from yesterday into tomorrow. All three layers, Seth argues, are controlled hallucinations. All three are the brain's best guesses about the causes of its own internal signals. None of them are found in the world. None of them are given by the data. They are generated. And like all predictions, they can be wrong. How do we know they're predictions? Because sometimes the prediction fails, and when it fails, the self comes apart. In depersonalization, the bodily self model weakens. People describe it as watching themselves from outside, as though the sense of ownership over their own body has loosened its grip. The body is still there. The perception of it continues, but the felt sense of mine, the prediction that binds experience to a self, has dimmed. They are still perceiving. They are no longer sure who is doing the perceiving. In psychosis, internal predictions can be misattributed as external events. A thought generated inside the predictive system is not tagged as mine. The model fails to claim it, and it arrives as a voice from somewhere else. The machinery is the same. The self model's ownership label has come unstuck. In ego dissolution, reported by experienced meditators and, more recently, studied in psychedelic research, the high-level self prior relaxes its grip. The boundary between self and world softens. People report that the sense of being a separate observer dissolves, and what remains is experience without an experiencer. Not unconsciousness, heightened consciousness, but without the frame that normally organizes it into me and everything else. Each of these is a malfunction of the predictive self model, and each one reveals, by its failure, what was being constructed all along, the sense of being you, continuous, bounded, looking out from behind your eyes, your brain's most sophisticated prediction, running so constantly that questioning it feels like questioning gravity. Seth puts it with characteristic precision. The many and varied elements of selfhood are Bayesian best guesses, designed by evolution to keep you alive, designed to keep you alive, not designed to show you what you are. 25 centuries before Seth wrote those words, the Buddha delivered a discourse so dense, so precise, and so radical that the commentary tradition has been unpacking it ever since. It is the Mullapariyaya Sutta, the root of all things, MN1. And it opens with one of the most striking psychological observations in the canon. The untaught ordinary person, the Buddha says, perceives earth as earth. So far, nothing unusual. Earth is earth. But then, and this is the move that matters, he conceives earth. He conceives himself in relation to earth. Earth is mine. I am in earth. I delight in earth. The Pali word is manyati, from the root man, to think, to conceive. The great scholar monk Bhikkhu Bodhi translates the implication precisely. Distortional thinking, thought that ascribes to its object characteristics derived not from the object itself, but from one's own subjective imaginings. Perception happens. Earth is perceived as earth. But then, on top of that perception, the self is conceived into the picture. Not found there, conceived there, added, projected. Mine, me, I am the one who perceives this. The perceiving was clean. The conceiving added a self that was never in the data. The parallel to Seth's self as prediction is not something you have to strain to see. The brain perceives, and then, in the same movement, generates a self who is doing the perceiving. The self is not the perceiver. The self is a layer added on top of perception, a prediction of ownership, continuity, and personal relevance that is so automatic, so constant, that it feels like the most obvious thing in the world. And the Buddha's contrast is equally precise. The Arahant, the one who has completed the training, also perceives earth as earth. The perception does not stop. The world does not disappear. But the Arahant directly knows, abhijanati, without the sticky addition of self-conception. The knowing is there. The I who knows is not added on top, not a different world, the same world, without the overlay. But the Buddha went further than describing this in a single discourse. He mapped the structure of the error itself. In the Vipassana Sutta, AAN 4.49, he identifies 4 fundamental inversions, 4 ways in which perception systematically misrepresents experience. We perceive what is impermanent as permanent. We perceive what is inherently stressful as pleasant. We perceive what is not self as self. We perceive what is unattractive, in the specific sense of being subject to decay, as attractive. These are not occasional mistakes. They are the default settings of unexamined perception, and they operate at 3 levels simultaneously. At the level of perception itself, saññā, where the label lands before thought begins. At the level of mind, where the label is elaborated into belief. And at the level of view, where belief solidifies into a framework through which everything else is interpreted. Consider a concrete case the Buddha himself might have recognized. You see a coiled rope in twilight. At the perceptual level, saññā, the label fires. Snake. Your body responds before thought arrives. Adrenaline, contraction, the urge to step back. At the level of mind, the label becomes interpretation. Danger, here, now. And at the level of view, the interpretation becomes a frame. The world contains hidden threats. I must be vigilant. I am someone to whom bad things happen. From a coiled rope to an identity, in less time than it takes to draw a breath, the error compounds upward. Each level receives the output of the level below and treats it as established fact. By the time you reach the level of view, you have forgotten that the whole edifice rests on a perceptual label that was assigned before you were aware it had arrived. Now recall the hollow mask. Your brain's prior, faces protrude, overrides the sensory data. You see convex when the reality is concave. You cannot unsee it. This is perceptual level inversion. Buddhism describes this phenomenon at the level of lived experience. The felt reality of seeing something that is not there, and being unable to stop seeing it, even when you know better. Neuroscience describes the computational mechanism, the Bayesian prior that outweighs the incoming evidence. Both are describing what may be the same thing. Neither needs the other's language, but each makes the other more precise. The correction the Buddha prescribes is samadhi, right view, not replacing wrong beliefs with right beliefs, as though you could simply swap one set of labels for another, but a systematic re-examination of every level of the hierarchy, beginning at perception itself, moving through mind, and arriving at view, in which the inversions are seen, recognized, and progressively loosened, not by argument, by attention, by the sustained trained willingness to look at what perception is actually doing, rather than at what perception says the world is, mirage. Both traditions end up in the same place. Look for the self, and what you find is a process, not a self-looking, a looking that generates the impression of a self, not an observer standing behind the eyes watching the world go by, but a cascade of predictions, labels, elaborations, and inversions that manufactures the observer as one of its outputs. Seth's 3 layers, bodily, perspectival, narrative, are all predictions. The Buddha's maññāti, the conceiving that adds I and mind to every perception, is a process that runs automatically below the threshold of awareness until it is deliberately examined. Both descriptions point to the same unsettling recognition. The one you take to be most real, yourself, is the one most thoroughly constructed. But here is where the two traditions begin to part. Because knowing this, really knowing it, not as an interesting fact, but as a lived recognition, leads to very different conclusions depending on which tradition you are standing in. For neuroscience, the discovery is remarkable, even beautiful. The self is the brain's masterpiece, its most intricate prediction, a hallucination so good that it convinced itself it was real. For Buddhism, the discovery is where the real work begins. Because the construction of the self is not just interesting, it is precisely where suffering takes root. And the question is not whether the self is constructed. Both traditions agree that it is, but whether anything can be done about it. Chapter 4. Where they meet and where they part. So here we are, two traditions, entirely different instruments, entirely different centuries, and yet standing in remarkably similar territory. Before we trace where they diverge, and they do diverge in ways that matter, it's worth being precise about where they converge, not to claim that one tradition validates the other. Neither needs that, but because the convergence itself is instructive. When two methods arrive at similar descriptions independently, it tells you something about the territory they're both mapping. The first convergence is about construction and suffering, and it's the one where Buddhism goes somewhere neuroscience does not. Predictive processing gives us a detailed, well-evidenced account of how perception is constructed. Top-down predictions, error correction, Bayesian updating, the whole cascade. It explains the mechanism beautifully, but it does not, and does not attempt to, explain why this mechanism generates suffering. In the predictive processing framework, construction is what brains do. It is the system working as designed. There is no problem to solve. The hallucination is the feature, not the bug. Buddhism agrees that construction is what minds do, but it adds a single, devastating observation. The products of that construction, especially the constructed self, become objects of clinging. Upadana. You don't just construct a self, you grip it, you defend it, you mistake it for something that must be maintained, protected and fed. And this gripping, applied to something that was never solid, never fixed, never what it appeared to be, is precisely where dukkha takes root. Not in the construction itself, in the clinging to what was constructed. Predictive processing maps how the morning was built. Buddhism explains why, after the morning was built, you suffered. The second convergence is the one we've been circling for the last 10 minutes. The self as prediction. Seth's conclusion that the self is a Bayesian best guess about interoceptive signals, a controlled hallucination packaged as a continuous I, and the Buddha's conclusion in the analysis of the 5 aggregates that when you search for a self in form, feeling, perception, fabrications and consciousness, you find only processes presenting as if there were a self, arrive at the same recognition through entirely different instruments. One uses brain scanners and computational models. The other uses sustained, trained, first-person attention directed at the structure of experience itself. Neither tradition finds a self. Both find a process that generates the impression of one, a remarkable double witness, not proof, not confirmation, but two independent observations pointing at the same absence, the kind of convergence that earns your attention precisely because it was not coordinated. The third convergence is more subtle, and it concerns the function of construction itself. Why do brains construct? Predictive processing has a clear answer. Because construction is adaptive. It optimizes survival. You don't need to see reality as it is. You need to see reality in whatever way keeps you alive and reproducing. The cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman has pushed this further with what he calls the fitness beats truth theorem, the mathematical argument that evolution selects for perceptions tuned to fitness, not to truth. Organisms that see reality accurately in Hoffman's models are consistently outcompeted by organisms that see useful fictions. Now, Hoffman's position is a provocative minority view, not the consensus in cognitive science, but the general principle that construction serves survival, not accuracy, is well within the mainstream. Buddhism does not disagree. Construction is biologically adaptive. The Buddha never suggested otherwise. What Buddhism adds is a different evaluative frame applied to the same mechanism. Construction serves survival, yes, and construction, applied to a self that is then clung to as permanent and essential, also generates suffering. These are not contradictory claims. They are two different scorecards applied to the same system. Survival rationality asks, does this keep the organism alive? Liberation rationality asks, does this keep the organism bound? Same mechanism, same construction, different questions, different answers. Now, where they part. And they part in three places that are worth being honest about, because the temptation in a video like this is to smooth over the differences and pretend that neuroscience and Buddhism are saying the same thing in different vocabularies. They are not. The similarities are genuine. So are the differences. The first disagreement is about the status of the mechanism itself. For Friston, Clark, and Seth, constructive perception is a description of what brains do, and it is, in a deep sense, a celebratory description. The brain is elegant. The prediction machine is extraordinarily well designed. The hallucination works. This is the system performing as evolved, and understanding it better is its own reward. There is no existential crisis in the predictive processing literature. There is wonder. For Buddhism, the same mechanism, the same construction, the same prediction, the same elaboration of self is precisely what binds beings to the wheel of craving and suffering until it is seen through. Not because construction is bad, not because the brain is flawed, but because identifying with the products of construction, taking the mirage for the water, the prediction for the world, the self-model for the self, is the root of dukkha. The mechanism is not the problem. The relationship to the mechanism is the problem. Same description, entirely different evaluation of what the description means for how to live. The second disagreement cuts deeper, and it concerns the limits of method. Predictive processing is a third-person framework. It describes the brain from the outside, measuring, modeling, computing. It is extraordinarily powerful at explaining what happens and how it happens, but it cannot, by design, by the nature of its instruments, address why there is experience at all, why prediction errors don't just update silently in the dark, the way a thermostat adjusts without feeling anything, why there is something it is like to see red, to feel disappointed, to recognize a face. This is what the philosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness. And Seth, to his credit, does not flinch from it. He writes plainly that simulating the brain on a computer is not, he suspects, sufficient to instantiate phenomenal experience. Predictive processing tells us what perception does and how it does it. It does not tell us why there is an experience of perception at all. Buddhism approaches from the opposite direction, from the inside through first-person investigation, and it arrives at its own frontier. There is a passage in the Kevada Sutta, DN 11, one of the most debated passages in the entire Pali Canon, where the Buddha speaks of vijnana anidasana, consciousness without surface, or consciousness without feature. Thanissaro Bhikkhu reads this as pointing beyond the constructed aggregates, toward a dimension of awareness that is not produced by the predictive machinery, not dependent on the 6 sense bases, not another layer of construction. It is, in his reading, where Buddhist investigation gestures beyond anything neuroscience currently has a framework to examine. But this reading is not uncontested. The scholars Bhikkhu Sujado and Ajahn Brahmali read the same passage quite differently, arguing against the interpretation that it points to a transcendent form of consciousness. The textual and doctrinal debate is ongoing, and serious scholars hold strong positions on both sides. What matters for us is this: Buddhist investigation, like the neuroscientific one, remains ongoing and unsettled at its own frontier. Neuroscience cannot yet explain why there is experience. Buddhism has not yet reached consensus on what if anything, lies beyond construction. Both traditions are honest enough, at their best, to acknowledge that they are still looking. And here is where the mathematical foundations themselves deserve a moment of care. Friston's free energy principle, the grand mathematical framework underlying predictive processing, is, at its most abstract level, not straightforwardly falsifiable. Critics have called it a tautology, a mathematical truth about self-organizing systems that cannot in principle be wrong and therefore cannot in principle be tested. Friston disputes this. The debate is real. But what matters practically is the distinction between the overarching principle and the specific process theories it generates. Predictive coding, active inference, which are testable and which have accumulated substantial empirical support. The grand unified theory remains contested. The working models work. The third disagreement is the most consequential. It's about what can be done. Neuroscience gives you knowledge. Buddhism claims to give you a practice, knowing about the hallucination, understanding predictive processing, reading Seth, studying Friston, does not change the hallucination. You can learn everything there is to know about the hollow mask illusion, and you will still see the protruding face. You can understand in exquisite detail how your brain constructs color, and the sunset will still look red. Knowledge about the mechanism does not alter the mechanism's output. The prediction runs. Knowing it's a prediction does not make it stop. Buddhism makes a stronger claim. It claims that with sustained practice, not reading, not understanding, but the disciplined, repeated first-person investigation of how construction occurs in real time, the relationship to construction can change fundamentally. The four vipallasa, the inversions that make you see permanence in the impermanent, self in the not-self, can be progressively addressed. Not by thinking differently, by attending differently. There is preliminary neuroscientific evidence that points in this direction. The researchers Laukkonen and Slagta published work in 2021, mapping deconstructive meditation onto the predictive processing framework, describing the practice as one that reduces the precision weighting of high-level priors, loosening the brain's confidence in its top-down predictions, including the prediction of a continuous self, until non-dual awareness emerges. Their findings are consistent with what contemplatives have reported across traditions and centuries, but they are preliminary. They are not proof of all Buddhist claims. They are an early, careful bridge between the two methods, built from the neuroscience side, reaching toward what practitioners have described from the inside. The hollow mask remains. You still see the face. But Buddhism claims, and 25 centuries of practice report support, though do not prove, that you can learn to see it as a face your brain is generating, rather than a face that exists. Not by force, not by argument, by a quality of attention that sees the construction as construction in the moment of its construction. Whether that claim is true, fully, completely, in the way the tradition says it is a question that neither neuroscience nor Buddhism has definitively answered. It is a question that may require both methods, working not in competition but in honest parallel to approach. Two completely different traditions. One looking at brains from the outside through machines. One looking at experience from the inside through trained attention. They have ended up describing perception in remarkably similar terms. Neither tradition needs the other to be true, but each illuminates the other in ways that are worth our time. So where does that leave you? Sitting here, watching your brain's best guess about this room. Chapter 5. What remains? The practice the Buddha prescribed for this, the practice that sits at the heart of the tradition's response to everything we've discussed, is vipassana, insight meditation. And it is worth being precise about what vipassana is, now that you know what you know. Vipassana is not the practice of stopping perception. The Buddha never suggested that construction could be halted, or that it should be. The brain will keep generating. The predictions will keep descending. The labels will keep landing before awareness arrives. That is what brains do. That is what minds do. Trying to stop it would be like trying to stop your heart by thinking about it. A misunderstanding of what is voluntary and what is not. Nor is vipassana the practice of accessing raw reality, some unfiltered, unmediated contact with the world as it truly is, stripped of all construction. The Buddha did not promise that. Predictive processing would tell you it is not possible. That there is no experience without prediction, no perception without construction, no seeing that is not already shaped by everything you have ever seen before. On this point, the two traditions agree. What vipassana is, what 25 centuries of practice have refined, is the training of attention to see the construction as construction. In the moment it is occurring, not after the fact, not as a theory, but as a lived, real-time recognition. This is arising. This is a label, not the thing. This is a feeling tone, not a verdict. This is a prediction, not the world. There is a short, luminous passage in the Anguttara Nikaya, AN 1.49 to 52, where the Buddha says, luminous, monks, is the mind, and it is defiled by incoming defilements. The Pali word for incoming is agantaka, adventitious, arriving from outside, not intrinsic. The defilements are not the nature of the mind, they are visitors. Practice does not create a new mind. It develops the capacity to recognize the visitors as visitors, to see what is arriving, what is being added, what is being constructed on top of what is already luminous. This is not what neuroscience describes. Neuroscience says, knowing about the illusion does not change the illusion. And for neuroscience, this is true. You cannot think your way out of the hollow mask. You cannot intellectualize your way past the color constancy that paints white onto shadow. Knowledge about the mechanism does not alter the mechanism's output. Buddhism makes a stronger claim, not that knowledge changes the illusion. On that, it would agree with neuroscience, but that a specific kind of sustained, disciplined attention, practiced over time, can change your relationship to the construction itself, not what is constructed, your relationship to it. The gripping loosens, the clinging, upadana, the taking up, the white-knuckled insistence that the prediction is the thing, begins to relax, not because you argued yourself out of it, because you watched it happen again and again and again, until the watching itself became more real than the story. The research is preliminary. The tradition is 25 centuries deep. Both deserve respect. Neither deserves uncritical acceptance. Fern, let's return, one last time, to the hollow mask. You are looking at it. You know it is hollow. You see it as a face, protruding, solid, three-dimensional. Your brain's prediction has overridden the evidence. You cannot unsee it. Neuroscience explains why. The prior is too strong, the prediction too deeply wired, the error signal too weak to overcome a lifetime of faces that protrude. Now consider the possibility, not as a certainty, but as a possibility worth 25 centuries of investigation, that there is a way of looking at the mask in which you see both, the face your brain generates and the hollowness behind it, not alternating, not choosing, seeing the construction and what is being constructed simultaneously, watching the film while knowing it is a film, not from the cold distance of analysis, but from the intimate nearness of someone who is still being moved by it, still feeling it, still in the room, but no longer mistaking the screen for the world. Your morning is still going to be constructed. Tomorrow's alarm will still trigger a cascade of predictions, labels, feeling tones, and proliferations that will set the mood before you know it's been set. Your brain will still generate the room you're sitting in, the colors that have no existence outside your skull, the self that seems to be watching it all from behind your eyes. None of that stops. The question Buddhism asks, the question no brain scanner has yet answered, the question that sits at the boundary where third-person measurement falls silent and first-person investigation begins, is not whether the construction can be stopped. It is what happens to suffering when you finally stop mistaking the generation for the thing generated.